This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 906 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, just as a reminder, make sure you're checking out Underdog Fantasy. If you sign up with promo code LATEROUND, you'll get a free pick plus a first-time deposit offer up to $1,000 in bonus cash. That's UnderdogFantasy.com. Sign up and use promo code LATEROUND. Get ready to sign up for this week's Sleeper Show, where I'll be talking through some more picks. But it's a 15 transactions day today. Let's do it. Add Isaiah Likely. The big question that everyone has right now is whether or not Isaiah Likely is the preferred tight end for the Baltimore Ravens. My answer to that is probably not, but I do think that he has a real chance to be a weekly starter. Over the first 2 years of Likely's career, he really only performed when Mark Andrews was sidelined. Even when Andrews was out last year, Likely's target share per game rate was only 14.5%. His yards per route run last year was 1.44. That's pretty ordinary. He was targeted on just 14% of his routes. In week 1, though, his numbers were completely different. He hit a 30% target share and he was targeted on over 34% of his routes run, according to PFF data. That was the result of the Ravens running a lot more 12 personnel. Last season, Baltimore's 12 personnel rate, that's when 2 tight ends are on the field, their 12 personnel rate was 11%. Last week against the Chiefs, it was 53%. Just for some context, last year the Falcons, they were the league leader in 12 personnel usage. Their rate was 42%. If that keeps up, then that means that Isaiah Likely is going to be on the field more. And if he's on the field more, he's going to run more routes. And if he's running more routes, he's going to score more points. Here's the thing, though, with the Andrews versus Likely debate. Andrews still finished week 1 with more routes run than Isaiah Likely. He was lined up in the slot or on the outside on over 78% of his routes run. For Isaiah Likely, it was 51%. To put that all another way, Andrews was playing more of a pass-catching role for Baltimore, even though the result said what it said. And that result is not that uncommon for Mark Andrews against the Chiefs. Since Steve Spagnuolo took over as defensive coordinator for Kansas City, Andrews has faced the Chiefs 5 times. In those games, here are his yardage totals: 15, 22, 57, 15, and now 14. According to Nate Yonke of PFF, Andrews was double covered on a higher percentage of his routes in week 1 than any of his games played from 2021 to 2023. It was very clear the Chiefs wanted Mark Andrews to not beat them. This really wasn't a normal outcome based on all of the usage metrics that we care about for tight ends in fantasy football. Mark Andrews should be able to bounce back. But just keep in mind that with more 12 personnel, legitimately, if they keep this up, there's a chance that we see both Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely as tight end ones this year. Hold or buy Drake London. No one wants to hear this right now. Not a single person listening to this podcast wants to hear me talk favorably about Drake London. Everyone's sick of it. Everyone's sick of him from a fantasy football perspective. Because all he's been, for the most part, is a disappointment. So like I said in my column this week, I'm going to say this very, very quietly. Now might be the time to buy low on Drake London. The Falcons' week 1 offense looked like it was being led by a 36-year-old quarterback coming off an Achilles injury. Kirk Cousins did not look right against the Steelers. His passes didn't have that much zip. It's not that surprising, but it's also somewhat of a concern. But what's most important with anything week 1, in a 1-week sample, things can just go wrong. Atlanta faced a very good Steelers front. That front pressured Cousins at the 6th highest rate among all teams in week 1. That's pre-Monday Night Football. London in particular saw a whole lot of Joey Porter Jr. And Joey Porter Jr. is becoming one of the better cornerbacks in football. Like, people are looking at the box score and they're saying, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Ray McCloud, he's the one that's leading the Falcons in receiving? But they don't look at the matchup enough. Literally, last week on the Sleeper Show, I talked about how the Steelers are bad against the slot. They're notoriously terrible at guarding slot wideouts. And so now London managers are really, really frustrated, despite the fact that it was a really tough matchup on paper. So in my opinion, if you can send a low ball offer, now is the time to do that. There's no need to get crazy aggressive here. I wouldn't do that. Because there are some worrying signs. Kirk Cousins' health being the number one concern. But this is likely not going to be the norm for Drake London. And something else to keep in mind. As we move forward in this season, and I know this is so far away, but in the fantasy football playoffs, the Falcons get the Raiders, Giants, and Commanders. That's an awesome schedule for a player like London. Buy Bijan Robinson. So while Drake London's kind of more of a hold, maybe lean buy, Bijan Robinson, straight up buy. He only scored 16.1 PPR points on Sunday, but his peripherals were out of control. He finished the day with an 85.7% running back rush share. And then through the air, he had a 21.7% target share. Last year, those numbers per game for Bijan Robinson were 48.5% and 17.5%. All offseason, we heard that Bijan Robinson could play a Christian McCaffrey role in this Falcons offense. And that's exactly what we got in week 1. It just came against a really good defense. If that type of workload continues, Robinson is going to destroy fantasy football this year. Add J.K. Dobbins. Now, I know that J.K. Dobbins might not be available in your league, especially if you listened to the Sleeper Show last week, but he's available in a lot of them. He's still out there in over half of Yahoo leagues. So I have to call him out on this show or else people will yell at me. But at the very least, this is a good opportunity to talk about what happened in that Chargers backfield in week 1. Dobbins scored 22.9 PPR points, but he only had 10 rushes and 3 targets. His 135 rushing yards, not going to be sustainable. But a performance like that, what we saw out of J.K. Dobbins this past week, that could lead to more work on the ground and through the air for Dobbins in that offense. Because according to Next Gen Stats, Dobbins' success rate on the ground, it was 50% against the Raiders. Gus Edwards was at 18%. The one concern I do have, obviously, is his health. He's coming off this Achilles injury. And according to Dr. Edwin Porras, there is concern about Dobbins' sustained explosiveness. That would obviously hinder his ability to score fantasy points within a committee, right? If he's in this committee, we need him to be efficient in order to score fantasy points. So that would be a problem. But with all that being said, he's definitely a top ad off the waiver wire this week. In leagues where I have him, because I do have some J.K. Dobbins, I'm willing to sell, but not with some sort of injury discount. We saw what Dobbins can do in this offense. And in week 2, this is another reason why I might not want to sell, is because week 2, they get the Panthers. He could have another great game. Sell Stephon Diggs. So the Texans ran 76 plays against the Colts this week. That was the most of any team heading into Monday Night Football. Because I'm recording this before Monday Night Football, so it could be out early in the morning for your Tuesday commute. But no team in football last year ran more than 70 plays per game across the season. The Texans were at 76. And all but 3 of the teams last year were below 66 plays per game. So the Texans are going to run fewer plays moving forward. And fewer plays means fewer opportunities. That leads to fewer fantasy points. Now at the player level, Diggs had a 19.4% target share. He caught all 6 of his targets. He scored 2 touchdowns. He had a wide receiver 1 outing. But the Texans did not use Stephon Diggs the same way they used Nico Collins and Tank Dell. Diggs finished the week ranked in the 90s in air yard share. He ended his game against the Colts with an ADOT of 1.5. Nico Collins had an average at the target of 15.5. Tank Dell was at 15.0. That's depending on your source. The way a player combats a lower ADOT role is through volume. And the problem for Stephon Diggs is that volume is going to be hard to come by because he's competing for looks with Nico Collins and Tank Dell. They're 2 very capable wide receivers. So if this Diggs usage continues, if he has this low ADOT role, that's going to be a problem because he's not going to be bailed out by multi-touchdown games each week. Add Jalen McMillan. As a lot of you know, the Zap model liked Jalen McMillan coming out. And while he only had a 10% target share in his NFL debut, there was a lot to like. He only had one reception, but it was a good reception. It was 32 yards and it was a touchdown. He scored 10.2 PPR points. But in that game, there was no doubt that McMillan was Tampa Bay's number 3 receiver. PFF had him with more routes run than Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, and he led all wide receivers on the Buccaneers in snaps. Now, it might be tough to trust McMillan each week, and the Bucs had a really, really good matchup against the Commanders in week 1, but he does have some flex appeal. And if an injury happens to either Evans or Godwin, then the upside is definitely there. It's hard to find a better wide receiver stash than Jalen McMillan. Buy Courtland Sutton. So I didn't love Courtland Sutton in fantasy drafts this year, mostly because he lacks ceiling. He was someone who could definitely outpace his ADP, but in most leagues, like a 10-team league or a 12-team league where you're only starting 2 wide receivers, he probably wasn't going to be an every week starter. And honestly, I kind of still feel the same way after what we saw in week 1. But there's definitely a buy low moment here with Courtland Sutton. He saw nearly 29% of Denver's targets, and he had an air yard share of 60%. According to PFF's expected fantasy points formula, Sutton underperformed by over 15 PPR points in week 1. Now, admittedly, in week 2, he's got a tough matchup against the Steelers. Maybe you'll want to wait another week and get him even lower. But statistically, he's at least someone to target. Add Ty Chandler. Ty Chandler had a decent finish to his 2023 season. He carved out a role in that Minnesota offense. Now, that role then took a hit because Minnesota signed Aaron Jones. But Chandler was still used in week 1 against the Giants, even with Aaron Jones in that lineup. Chandler finished the day with a 35% running back rush share and a 13% target share. He only ran 3 fewer routes than Aaron Jones did. Maybe that was simply due to game script, but Chandler's still out there in 2/3 of Yahoo leagues. He's got some flex appeal, but also has that contingent upside with an Aaron Jones injury. Buy Amari Cooper. So there are a lot more buys than sells this week because NFL offenses in week 1 were absolutely horrible. When there's an underperformance, there's a buying opportunity. Now, Deshaun Watson, probably not the answer for Cleveland. But the Browns also won't be facing the Cowboys each week. Now you have David Njoku, who's a little bit banged up, and Amari Cooper, despite scoring 3.6 PPR points against the Cowboys, he had a 20.9% target share. That's totally fine. His expected fantasy points total had him closer to 12 or 13 PPR points. Again, he had 3.6. With David Njoku injured, that could force more looks to the team's wide receivers. But also, the Browns get much, much better matchups moving forward. They get the Jags, Giants, Raiders, Commanders, and Eagles over their next 5 games. So Amari Cooper should see his fantasy value rise during this stretch. Add Justin Fields. So I didn't get to talk about Justin Fields last week because Russell Wilson's injury happened after this show was published. But let me give you some data surrounding Fields. There have been 117 regular season performances since 2011 where a quarterback ran the ball more than 10 times. About 88% of those outings resulted in more than 15 fantasy points scored by the quarterback. And over 60% of those quarterbacks, they scored at least 20 fantasy points. Justin Fields against the Falcons on Sunday, he had 14 rush attempts. He only scored 11.9 points. And you're going to say, that's because Justin Fields is bad. It's really not that simple, though. Fields has played in 9 games prior to week 1 where he ran the ball more than 10 times. He was a top 8 quarterback scorer in 8 of those 9 games. He averaged over 25 points per game in those contests. Now, again, I didn't get to talk about Justin Fields last week, but I do think there's a chance that he's still a starter moving forward. Just because his fantasy total wasn't great in week 1 doesn't mean that's how it's going to be moving forward. I think Justin Fields needs to be rostered in almost every league. Add Alexander Mattison. So Antonio Pierce came out on Monday and he said that the Raiders are going to roll with a hot hand at running back. And this comes after a week 1 where Zamir White was outsnapped by Alexander Mattison. Mattison had 36 offensive snaps. Zamir White had 23 against the Chargers. And Mattison played a receiving role. He ran 24 routes. Zamir White ran 10. Based on that usage alone, Madison would be the preferred running back in that offense. If this were to continue week in and week out, we would prefer Alexander Madison. But a hot hand approach means that things are going to fluctuate. So that's nowhere close to a guarantee. So right now, you probably have to hold Zamir White if you still have Zamir White, and you have to add Alexander Madison off the waiver wire. And for deep leagues, don't forget about Dylan Laube too. Maybe the Raiders just get really, really frustrated with what they have at running back, and they want to give the rookie the ball more. Buy Keon Coleman. So speaking of rookies, Keon Coleman, he didn't have the best outing of all Buffalo Bills wide receivers in week 1. That was Khalil Shakir. But Coleman's outing was still really encouraging, especially for his first game in the NFL. He ran a route on 90% of Buffalo's dropbacks. That was by far the best number of any wide receiver on that team. Shakir was second on the team at 70%. That led to a 21.7% target share and a 28% air yard share. Remember, this is game 1 of Keon Coleman's career. You're in a very good offense with a very good quarterback. When you see encouraging signs like that, you have to pounce. Add Demarcus Robinson. So Puka Nacua has a knee injury and he was put on IR on Monday. Based on what Twitter doctors are saying, he's probably not going to be back until mid-season. Demarcus Robinson is the next man up in that wide receiver rotation because he ran the second most routes for the Rams in week 1. Now, Robinson's had his moments in this offense over the last year. Just last season in his final 6 games, he had a target share per game above 16%. He was a top 30 wide receiver in PPR formats in 5 of those 6 games. But don't forget about Tyler Johnson either. He might be the better value off the waiver wire this week. I like Demarcus Robinson straight up more, there's no doubt. But Tyler Johnson is more of an afterthought for people. If your league does blind bidding waivers, Johnson just might straight up be the value play. You might be able to get him just for a couple of bucks, whereas Demarcus Robinson is going to go for a lot more. And the reason I say that is because no team in the NFL uses more 11 personnel than the Los Angeles Rams. So you're going to have Demarcus Robinson, Cooper Kupp, and Tyler Johnson, who played that role when Puka Nacua went down, those 3 wide receivers, likely as your 3 wide receivers and 11 personnel. And by the way, for the record, the Zap model really liked Tyler Johnson when he came out. A lot of you probably remember that. So don't forget about Tyler Johnson either. And there's also Colby Parkinson, who should get a bump. He was on last week's 15 Transactions episode. And then you can stash Jordan Whittington too. Whittington had a really strong camp. He was getting a lot of buzz out of LA this summer. He's a good yards after the catch kind of player, but he profiles more as a slot guy. But he can make his way onto the field a little bit more now too. So prioritize Demarcus Robinson, but understand that you might get a better value out of someone like Tyler Johnson. Add Tank Bigsby. So we have a lot of running backs who have some flex appeal in deeper formats, but also have injury upside. They're the right kind of running backs that you want on your bench. Maybe it's Justice Hill. He had a 20% week 1 target share. Maybe it's Bucky Irving, who worked pretty well with Rachaad White in week 1. There are choices out there that you can go and grab. I'm calling out Bigsby this week because his week 1 performance really matched the coach speak that we were hearing out of Jacksonville this summer. They've wanted to give Travis Etienne some sort of pairing. Another reliable body in that backfield. And yeah, Bigsby had a historically bad rookie season. But he looked okay in week 1. And he saw as many carries as Etienne. And he outrushed Etienne. Etienne got way more work as a receiver. He ran way more routes. That's going to be his role. But Bigsby looks like he could be another flex plus player. A guy who might be able to play the flex, but then he obviously has upside if his RB1 gets hurt. So you can group up Tank Bigsby with guys like Justice Hill and Bucky Irving this week. Maybe even Zach Charbonnet, given Kenneth Walker's health. And that's a little bit up in the air right now. Your choice largely depends on your roster construction. And for the record, I'm not mentioning Jordan Mason because he's rostered in too many Yahoo leagues. He gets priority over all of these guys because it sounds like Christian McCaffrey might miss next week too. Add the Los Angeles Chargers defense. So I mentioned the Chargers on last week's episode. If you hold on to them, you can use them again this week. They're traveling to Charlotte and they get the Panthers. Now the Chargers were pretty average at generating pressure in week 1 according to Next Gen Stats. but they rank 6th best in EPA per play allowed while limiting the Raiders to just 10 points. Carolina, as we saw in week 1, had arguably the worst offense in the NFL, or at least the worst offensive display. This game right now has a 39.5 point over-under, and the Panthers are 5.5 point home underdogs. So LA makes for a nice streamer once again. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode.